Hey guys, what's up? This is FallsBlues123, and guess what? I'm back on my channel. Now, one of the things I've been noticing is that for a lot of booktube channels at the end of the year in December, they like to talk about the best books they've read and the worst books they've read. And so, that's what I'm gonna do. Not because I like to shamelessly follow trends, but because I'm trying to find a framework to push my content into. Now, one of the things that's super big at the end of the year is that Goodreads does their best of the year reviews. A lot of it is just a shameless popularity contest. Usually Stephen King wins horror every year, and honestly, I'm not that deep into the culture to really understand the nuances, especially since I've read maybe 3 or 4 books that came out this year. I know, I am human trash, but let's be honest, this is pretty on brand for me. I'm too busy reading obscure old shit to be reading obscure new shit. It's been a pretty good year of reading for me. I've gotten back into it, and I think that as far as reading goes, I made a pretty good effort with all the other stuff that I'm doing in my life and a lot of the other stress I've been going through. So, according to my Goodreads, I've read 60 books this year. That's fantastic. Go me. And I thought what would be really fun is I would tell you my picks for each of the genres that I've read. Obviously, genres can be very subjective. So what I did was I literally just ripped off the genres from the Goodreads Choice Awards and decided to put my own nominations, so to speak. So let's actually get into them. I need to mention there are a few genres that I did not have a pick for, and that is because I have not read enough books in that genre to really have a good opinion. Those are as follows: historical fiction, history and biography, graphic novels and comics, poetry, and that's it. So I guess just those 3. So let's actually get started on the categories. So first up is fiction. Now, I chose 2 books for this category, like a little bit of a tie, and I think that they were both really great choices. Also, I don't believe any of the books I chose for this video came out in 2020. Most of these are backlists, just to let you know. So the first novel we're going to be talking about today is Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. Now, this story follows a non-binary person named Ada, who is possessed with Onwauchi, which is essentially a Nigerian folklore myth that's very similar to the European changeling. I'm not going to get into too many details about it, but essentially it deals with a lot of real-world issues such as sexual assault, mental health, gender identity, and also, a fair amount of religion. And so it's a very personal and a very emotional book that also deals with the African diaspora. And so it's a very interesting novel. It's a very well-written and creative novel. And it's also really fantastic because it features a non-binary protagonist and is written by a non-binary author. And so that own voices right there is just a fantastic blend of both, I guess, cultural diversity and really well-written discussions of trauma. Obviously, it is a very difficult book to read because of that, so if you are sensitive to that material, please be advised. Next up, to tie this, is Everything I Never Told You by Celeste. So this is probably what I'd probably deem both of these literary fiction, given the subject matter. So I already find Everything I Never Told You as a drama. It essentially follows several generations of an Asian American family and the issues and prejudices they face after the death of essentially their favorite child, who drowns mysteriously. I originally thought this story was a thriller, but it really is a very detailed drama that deals with things such as sexism, xenophobia, and I guess parental favoritism as well. All of the characters have these very deep, in-depth backstories and about how a lot of different things such as, generational trauma and microaggressions affect them. And so it is just a really emotional, a really well-written book, and it shook me. That's all I'm going to say. Definitely recommend both of these books to you. I think they're fantastic. I'm pretty sure they've won awards, and I think they've also won Goodreads Choice Awards as well. So, obviously, I'm really, reaching for the stars with these recommendations. But good books gotta be good. That's just how, I guess, critique works. Anyway, to move on, hopefully to a more natural presentation, is our mysteries and thrillers. Next category is mysteries and thrillers. So I have a lot of mysteries on my shelves. They're definitely a genre that I've enjoyed. Thrillers are a bit more new to me. There's a lot of modern adult genres that I really just haven't had a chance to dip my toes into. And so it's really been an interesting growing experience, I guess, as an adult, to explore this. So I've read a few thrillers this year. Some of them have been really great. Some of them have been awful, but I definitely have one fantastic one to recommend you guys. This is the first book I read this year, and that was Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. I actually did a full book review on it. If you guys want to check that out, I'll try to put a card up there. Sometimes I forget, so I'll put it in the description as well. Maybe. But essentially, Gone Girl follows the story of Amy, took me a second to remember her name, who essentially frames her husband for murder because he was a little bit of a hoe. And so at first you really get this sense of female empowerment about how she stuck it to the man because fuck that guy for being a whore. But as this book goes on, you really kind of get a better sense of the character. And what I really like about Gillian Flynn is that she makes these very deep female antagonists. And a lot of the story deals with, I guess, sort of a feminist perspective, in the sense it's all about really women and empowerment and relationships and stuff like that. But she does it in a way that is not trite, that's not overhanded, and she really has an intense thriller aspect to it. So, as my first introduction to the genre, definitely reading a very popular book, I was just like, damn, that was some good shit. I'm going to be reading more thrillers in the future. Definitely coming up is Girl on the Train, so that's going to be really interesting. But definitely recommend it. I'm going to have to try to read the rest of the book because it was great. Next up was fantasy. Now, I am not a big fantasy reader, which is kind of interesting because I like D&D and that's very much fantasy, but I digress. I'm trying to think back into my childhood, and the only fantasy novels I enjoyed were Rick Riordan, which is actually pretty apropos since my pick for this year is American Gods by Neil Gaiman. Now, I love Neil Gaiman. I read the original Sandman series, not all of it, but some. I read the Graveyard Book, which introduced me to the character. And he's also married to one of my most favorite singers of all time, Amanda Palmer. American Gods is essentially an adult version of Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series, or basically any other series he's done, because he writes of that subject matter. And in it is the idea that gods are a form of, thought form, where basically the belief in them allows them to have power in society. This might have also been the inspiration for a majority of the lore in my D&D campaign, but don't tell anybody. Essentially, American Gods is this epic adventure featuring a really wonderfully diverse cast, not only of the gods, but of the people the mortals that you go. And it features a lot of lore, it features a lot of discussion of Americana and cultural history, and it is just a fun time. If you like anything that Rick Riordan has ever written, if you like that style, and you want to read something more, mature, this is fantastic. There's titties, there's blood, and there's just some great mythos to sink your teeth into. So for someone like me personally, who's not super into epic fantasy, but is super into folklore and cultural myths, this is the shit. But let's move on. Next up was romance. I'm not a big romance reader. Really, the only romance author I like is Nora Roberts, mostly because she knows how to blend genres like suspense and thrillers into her works well, and because she can write some steamy stuff, and on the scale of wholesome to smutty, I'm all the way here, because you gotta have some good steam to it. So the book I chose was Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. Red, White, and Royal Blue is a male-male romance which is set in an alternate history of the 2016 election. Instead of hiring the racist Cheeto Man to be our president, they instead elected a wonderful Latinx woman instead. Which is just... why couldn't we have that for the 2016 election? Like, really? One thing I definitely enjoyed about the book was its use of politics as a backdrop to the story. Both of the characters, Alex is the first son of the president, while Henry is the prince of, the royal family in Britain. And so both of them are very much entrenched into the political atmosphere of the story. Politics and the election feature heavily into the plot of the story, and a lot of it actually discusses things like media presence and image, and how LGBT persons are seen in a political spectrum, especially when it comes to public figures. And so, from that perspective, it was really interesting, and it was also just really freaking wholesome. This gives my stamp of approval for good gay shit, because it was just a lovely time. Also, if you're wondering from the smutty to steamy level, it was pretty hot and heavy in some scenes, so I'm looking out for you, boo. Next up is a genre I definitely read a bit more of, and that is science fiction. I am a big science fiction fan, and if you look at my library, which you can't see, but it's there, trust me, I have a lot of classical sci-fi, from Asimov to Bradbury. So I have 2 books, once again it's a tie, and these are what they are. First up, we have The Martian by Andy Weir. This was pretty much a cultural phenomenon for a while. It got made into a movie with Matt Damon, which I have not seen, and so I picked it up on the whim. So, some things I liked was its comedic stylings. It was hilariously funny. Its Crichton-esque usage of detail in the story, which is something I really enjoy in science fiction, is when they get into the nitty-gritty. And also its epistolary format, since a majority of the book is written as progress logs by the main character. A little bit of a plot for you. Basically, you have this man, he goes to Mars on a mission. He gets left Home Alone style on the surface of the red planet, and he gotta survive. Gosh dang it. But it's a really interesting story that's set in the near future, and it's a pretty realistic look on how we would actually colonize Mars. So, it was a fun time, and I definitely recommend it. The other one is a little bit more esoteric, if you will, and that is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. So, This Is How You Lose the Time War is basically the best story I ever read about time-traveling lesbian spies. Essentially, you have 2 characters, the names are Red and Blue, just like that really funny show that they used to have with the shooty people. And essentially, they are rival spies in these 2 great time agencies who are trying to control the narrative of history. And basically, they start off with taunting each other and being like, haha, bitch, you failed. But then they're just like, damn, sometimes I think about your dreamy eyes and it's kind of hot. And they basically start having this romantic relationship through letters. The entire thing is... actually, let me phrase that. So, the majority of the story is told through these long, poetic, emotional letters, with the other half of the book being descriptions of how they find these letters, and it's always in really unique ways. The first letter they get is very traditional pen and paper, but after that, since they're super future time beings, they get these letters in really complicated ways, like the dance of a bee, or the rings in a tree, or the DNA of these poisonous berries, and all these different creative and amazing ways to write these letters. And so it's poetic and imaginative and creative, and it's a good time. It is probably one of the most emotional, one of the most beautiful books I've read. I actually listened to an audiobook, but that is not heard it. And I just recommend it to anyone that you can possibly want to read it, because that was some good shit. I did not want to put it down, and I cannot say that about a lot of books. So, I'm going to move on, and we're going to go on to horror. Now, I am a huge horror fan, but weirdly enough, I don't read that many horror books. I don't know why. Maybe it's just because I don't see horror novels as much, like, on my radar, or maybe they're not as clearly advertised, but I only tend to read maybe 4 or 5 horror books a year. As opposed to something like TV shows or movies, I watch more. For instance, of the 60 or so movies I've watched this year, majority of them have been horror. Maybe 4 or 5 have not been. So, obviously, I consume a lot of horror, just not a lot of horror books. Anyway, I digress. Horror pick of the day is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. I know I won't shut up about this book, but it was so freaking good. Basically, imagine a sort of King-esque horror story, but it has a very deep cultural understanding of Native American culture. So, The Only Good Indians follows 4 friends who've basically been haunted by some bad shit they did when they were young and stupid. And now they're being haunted by a folkloric entity that wishes to seek revenge for, harming their young. I'm not going to get into too many details, but basically it is just a fantastic supernatural thriller that deals with both the folklore and history of the Blackfoot tribe. Some things I really loved was its usage of culture and its discussion of it in the book. Obviously, this is from a Native American author writing about Native American characters, and that was really amazing. I also loved its use of folklore as a way of really providing color to the story. And I also enjoyed just the writing style. There were so many moments where I was just literally shocked by just how quickly some of the events happened. It was intense, it was visceral, and it was just so well written. I am literally going to pick up anything Stephen Graham Jones ever writes because I love this book. I think it was a great horror novel, and if you like King or even anything by Richard Bachman, I know they're written by the same guy, but we're not going to get into the details of that. Definitely I would pick this up because it is fantastic, well-written horror. Switching lanes, another thing I like to do besides scream and sit with my lights on, holding a rosary, praying for death not to take me, is to have a nice laugh every once in a while. Now, I got to read a few humorous memoirs by some of my favorite funny peoples, and the one that I am going to choose is Yes Please by Amy Poehler. I am a huge fan of Parks and Rec. It's probably one of my favorite sitcoms of all times, and I love Amy Poehler to bits. She's fantastic, she's great. And also, did you know she helped found the United Citizens Brigade? I did not know that. That's really cool. Yes Please is just a really fantastic memoir featuring a bunch of different parts of her life, from her experiences with United Citizens Brigade, her time on SNL, and also the beginnings of her work in Parks and Recreation. And so it really hits a lot of the highlights of her career and her life. And it also has a lot of really funny stories and anecdotes from her times there, as well as more strange, humorous segments, like sections written by her parents, or a haiku about plastic surgery that was read by Patrick Stewart. I just really loved Amy Poehler's personality and character, which really shines in the book, and I really loved reading about different sections of her life, especially since I don't know much about, SNL, and I was actually really interested in UCB since I learned a lot about it when I was writing about podcasts when I was younger. So it was a really interesting and also enlightening book, and I just had a fun time with it. It was really funny. Another book I just want to shout out real quick is I'm Just a Person by Notaro. It is literally written by my favorite no-titty lesbian, which is a phrase I will always say unless people find it offensive. And it was really sad and deep and personal, but it was also super funny, and she's amazing and I love her. Anyway, let us move on. Next up, we started with fiction, and now we're on to non-fiction. Obviously, nonfiction can be a gigantic genre of hundreds of different styles of things, but I've been able to narrow it down to 3 books. First up is How to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. So How to Talk About Race deals with a lot of different subjects such as basically white people just having a weird thing about black people's hair, the minority myth, the school to prison pipeline, and other such issues. And I really enjoyed the discussion because it was very direct, it was very detailed, and it also helped me really understand a lot of misconceptions I had about very specific liberal ideologies, such as cultural appropriation and intersectionality. And so I think it was a really great primer into discussing identity politics, which was something that I was definitely put off from a lot of sort of the rhetoric of 2014 gender discussion. SJW and anti-SJW rants were a very big thing at that time politically, and that's really where I developed a lot of my own political thought. So by reading Oluo's work, I was actually able to really understand and check a lot of misconceptions I had about things such as intersectionality. Really great book. If you want to read it, I do suggest it. But let's move on to something that's a bit more intense and niche, and that is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. So The New Jim Crow is much more centered. It discusses primarily the prison industrial complex and how both historically and nowadays it affects the lives of African Americans and other people of color. It was very educational. It was very informative. I do think at times it could be a bit dry, but the main takeaway from it is just how fucked up the judicial system is and how the war on drugs is not only detrimental towards our country in the sense that it militarizes our police, but also in the sense that it creates a bunch of toxic and really anti-constitutional laws that degrade our judicial system. Pretty much, as long as you have drugs on you, the police can do whatever the fuck they want, and that's not much of an overstatement. I would definitely recommend it, even though it is a bit hard to get through given its very dry, intense writing style, but it is definitely a great resource if you're trying to learn about the prison industrial complex. It gets into it. Lastly is a book of lighter notice, and it's just about a serial rapist and murderer, so priority trying. And that was I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara. So I'll Be Gone in the Dark is a true crime novel focusing on the Golden State Killer and one woman's hunt to discover him. Michelle McNamara was a true crime writer who had a blog. I don't remember the name of it, but I'll put a name if I can. And I was actually married to Patton Oswalt, so 2 out of 2 for power couples out here. Unfortunately, she passed away in her sleep halfway through writing this novel, and so a lot of the story is actually pieced together from her notes, from different interviews with people that knew her, as well as articles she had written on the subject. And so in a sense, it is a fix-up novel. Also, it features an introduction by Gillian Flynn and an outro by Patton Oswalt, as well as just a super intense and just damn bitch letter written by McNamara herself, where she's just like, I'm gonna get you, Golden State Killer, you better be watching yourself, and it was just a good time. I think it was a really interesting novel. It was very in-depth, and I loved how she really humanized and provided a lot of context to the crimes as they happen. They really gave the victims a sense of identity, which made it a lot more impactful. And I think that's one of the things that's really great about true crime, and she does it so well. I'm really sad she passed away because she was obviously a very talented and reportedly a very kind and nice person, so rest in peace, McNamara. Moving on, we're going to talk about a category I do enjoy, and that is food and cookbooks. Now, I did not read any cookbooks this year. I know I am a whore and a scandalous trollop, but I did read quite a bit of food writing. I believe I read 4 or 5 memoirs of the subject, and I enjoyed myself quite a bit. I also have a bunch of clipped recipes somewhere in my screenshots that I need to sort and print out, but in my own time, you know. This is going to be another Thai category, and we're going to be picking My Life in France by Julia Child. I've talked about this extensively on my channel. Basically, it follows Julia Child's introduction to food after she moved to France after the wars, and it's just a great time. I love Julia Child. I loved how she discussed things, and it was actually one of the books that was written near the end of her life. I believe it was published posthumously, but do not quote me on that. Basically, I loved it. I love Julia Child. You should read it. Next up is a much younger and still alive person, and that is Notes from a Young Black Chef by Kwame Onwauchi. So, Kwame Onwauchi is a fine dining chef. He is a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America, and in his book, he discusses a lot about the African diaspora and how that relates to the culinary world and his own experiences in the fine dining realm. Now, while I am a culinary graduate, while I do work in the industry, I have never worked in fine dining, and so it was a really interesting look at that aspect of the cooking world. That's really what a lot of people think about when they think about the culinary world in general, is this very cutthroat, this very elite world where everything is a foam or a mousseline or a compote. And so there is some aspects of that, but it was also a really great book reading about his entrepreneurial spirit and also about the African diaspora, which he gets into and how that affects both his culinary view and the world of and the culinary perspective as well. And so that was a really great perspective to read from, and it's something that I really love to read about, especially since so much of the culinary realm is based on one's personal experiences with food and the heritage. And so that was really great. It also deals with the issue of prejudice in the culinary industry. And that was also something that I thought was really enlightening and something that we do need to think about, both as people of the industry and just as regular people as well, and how the arts is affected by things such as racial and sexual prejudice. So, really great book. Definitely recommend it. Kwame Onwauchi is just a super cool person, and I am absolutely fascinated in his career. One day I hope to meet him, just to let you know that. So we're skipping a few categories like I mentioned before, and we're going to be going down to debut novel. I didn't read too many debut novels this year, but I did read one. I believe it was for Reading Rush, and that was Such a Fun Age by Kiley Reid. So, Such a Fun Age follows the story of a young black babysitter and her interactions with essentially the upper middle class white people that she surrounds herself with. It's a discussion of class struggles, of the way that race affects people, especially, I guess, performative white allyship is the buzzwords that people use. Some things I really enjoyed about the book was the way the characters were written, the dialogue, and also just how dramatic the entire thing was. Like, it was some intense drama, and you were like... But it also featured probably one of the most dynamic and interesting characters I've read this year, and that was Amira Tucker, who I'm not going to get into too much detail in this video, but if you haven't read it, it's definitely worth a read, and it's definitely something that discusses a lot of things like race relations and class in a way that is not overly direct or ham-fisted. And so if you're looking for a work that is own voices, that is in those sort of themes, that isn't overly, I guess, political or overly about that discussion, definitely read it. A lot of subtext, a lot of main text. Okay, so that was all the adult genres, and just for fun, because I read a weird amount of children's books this year for some reason, let's discuss young adult, middle grade, and the children's categories. First up is young adult fiction. And I chose The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. The Hate You Give follows the story of Star Carter, who witnesses her best friend being shot by policemen during a pretextual stop. A lot of the book deals with the issues of police brutality, it deals with the issues of the Black Lives Matter movement, specifically by focusing on how she deals with the legal and judicial process of her friend's death. On top of that, it deals with a lot of other issues that plague black youth, such as microaggressions, dealing with interracial dating, and a lot of the ways that police officers interact with her neighborhood, which is a lower class, inner city urban neighborhood. Obviously one that is affected by redlining. And so, for the vast majority of it, they discuss so many different issues that plague the black community, such as gang violence, such as drug addiction, and other such things, but it's all done through the eyes of Star Carter. And so it deals with so many different issues, so many different problems these people face, but it's also surprisingly wholesome at times. It has a very strong Star Carter has a very strong family and support network. She has all these friends, and there's a lot of emotional depth to the book. It was probably one of the most emotional and probably one of the most intense books I read during the year. This is definitely something you could call a great American novel. It deals very much with the zeitgeist and with the issues of the time, specifically for her intersectionality. And it's just, if you're going to read any young adult novel this year, I would recommend it. Obviously, I believe this came out last year. Angie Thomas has several books now set in the universe, and they probably are all great. I haven't had a chance to read them, but This was worth every bit of hype that it got, and please do read it. Next up, let's go to a category I feel slightly less strongly about, and that is young adult fantasy. Obviously, it's young adult, but it's fantasy. Didn't read too much of it, but I do have a great contender for this genre, and that is The Coldest Girl in Cold Town by Holly Black. Now, when it comes to urban fantasy, I'm definitely much more interested in the genre, though I've never really been a big fan of vampires. They're fun, they're interesting, but they also feel a bit played out if we're being honest. Now, Coldest Girl in Cold Town is a pretty unique take on that, where essentially all the vampires that exist or have been pretty much imprisoned in ghettos called cold towns, which they live and prosper, and a lot of wackadoodles are just like, ooh, vamp daddy, you should suck my blood. There's also vampire reality television shows, and for the most part, the idea of vampires existing in the mortal realm and it's like a mainstream thing actually plays really well into how it's integrated into the world building. The world building is really strong, and that's one of the great aspects of the story. Now I'm going to give you a short synopsis, and then we're going to move on because this video is getting kind of long. Basically, it follows Tanya. She's your essentially pretty standard young adult protagonist. She has a boyfriend, but they broke up, and he's kind of still tailing around, and she's like, whatever. And she also has a complicated past with vampires and vampire infection, which actually gives her an amazing amount of emotional depth as she goes through the issues of being infected throughout the course of the story. She deals with the kind of rough and tumble world of the Cold Town as she braves a lot of both vamp scene kids being crazy wackadoodles and also the macabre and dangerous world of actual vampire parties. And there's just so many really great aspects of the book. LGBT representation is just there, really great world building, and just a fun urban fantasy setting. As young adult novels go, I actually didn't mind a lot of the more obnoxious tropes that you see, like love triangles or just all the romance stuff that just feels kind of forced in, because Holly Black knows how to write a good book, and I just had a great time. Next up is going to be middle grade and children's, really broad category. Didn't read that much middle grade this year, but I did pick Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. This came out when I was in high school, and if we're being honest, I did not pick it up until like 4 years later, like every other book that I want to read. It was fantastic. It used all of these old-timey photos in a really interesting way. It was just a solid dark fantasy book, and it definitely gives me a lot of hopes for, I guess, middle grade fantasy in the future, because most of the books I read when I was younger were like, they were okay, but this was amazing. I definitely want to read the rest of the books in the series, and I think it is a fantastic novel. I understand the hype. Moving on, we're going to the last category, and that's picture books. Now, I read a few picture books, maybe 4 or 5, and these were totally not at all meant to just slightly hyperinflate my wrap-ups at all. I'm just teasing. They were short, I'm just like, why not? I got 5 minutes. So the one I chose was A Church for All by Gail E. Pittman. So A Church for All was essentially discussing opening and assuring churches, which, if you don't know, are churches which are LGBT inclusive. If they don't use a queer-centric interpretation of the Bible, they generally use queer-inclusive interpretations where they use a lot of history. And I'm not going to get into the details of how that works or the exact theological connotations of it, but essentially, they're okay with the gays. That's the gist of it. And so the novel was... And so the picture book was just a really nice and wholesome look at inclusivity, intersectionality, and how that everyone is really... should be accepted under, like, the Brotherhood of Man in a religious institute. And I thought it was really nice. I feel a lot of the times, especially with religious children's literature, it can be very homophobic, and it can definitely be a lot of other problematic issues. And so reading a book that was really based and really inclusive, it was just a nice time, and it gives me hope for the future. Now guys, obviously, we're wrapping up this video, and I just wanted to let you know there are some things you can do to help me grow my channel. Aren't you special? Like this video if you liked it, comment if you have some thoughts about what I said, and of course, please do subscribe if you're not subscribed already. That would be great. As well, if you want to, share this with a friend. I don't know who wants to hear me talk about books all day, but I'm sure there's some friend out there that wants you to do it. Anyway guys, Wash your hands, tell your loved ones you love them, and live every single day trying to be a better person. This False Bills 1, 2, 3, and you guessed it, I'm signing off.